I have a little bit of a cold and I've been talking all day for work, so hopefully I don't sound really annoying. I'm kind of scared that I'm going to listen back to this and cringe. It is almost midnight on December 16th, so really getting to the end of 2025 here. I just want to tell you about the 10 or so favorite books that I have from 2025. And yeah, this is going to be like a slow, chatty video. I'm excited to talk about these. I'm still technically reading a couple books, or 3 books here. I haven't finished these 3 yet. I hope to finish them before the end of the year. I think that I will. I am appreciating all of these, but I can already tell you that none of them are going to be favorites from the year. So I have been able to narrow down my list of favorites. I've got maybe 10 books out of, I don't actually know how many I read this year. Upwards of 55, maybe. One thing that has changed since the last time I updated you about my reading is I totally broke up with Goodreads. Well, not totally, technically yet. I've stopped using Goodreads for tracking my actual reading, like the books that I have read. I still have all my TBR on Goodreads. I've switched over at one point to Storygraph. I want to like fully switch though and eventually actually delete Goodreads. I'm kind of split between both of them right now. I'm definitely done with tracking my current reads and tracking my reading history with Goodreads and with apps. I've just been using this notebook actually. So I guess I could go through and count. I haven't been numbering them for each year, but you can see it's just like a list of the books. I'm not really doing anything except for writing down the titles and the year. So anyway, yeah, I don't really know exactly how many books I've read in 2025. Somewhere north of 50 books, a lot of reading this year. My reading actually slowed down quite a bit in the last quarter of the year. I had a kind of insane reading slump. By the way, I'm drinking Perfect Peach from Bigelow Tea, I think it's pronounced. But yeah, kind of a crazy reading slump towards the end of the year. I've been gradually getting out of it, and part of getting out of it for me has been getting rid of Goodreads and kind of my relationship with reading has been changing as I read more and as I've been like an active reader for almost a decade at this point, I guess. And so my feelings around reading have been changing pretty significantly over the past 1 or 2 years. But like my habits weren't keeping up with those changes, if that makes sense. I think as I'm shifting my habits around reading to like more closely match my mindset, I've been kind of getting out of this long reading slump, which is nice. But anyway, I'm kind of precariously balancing my tea on a space heater over here. So if that spills and I start an electrical fire, I'm gonna blame you personally. Okay, I'm back. I had this stack of all these favorite books on my bed, and I felt the need to grab them all for some reason. I don't think I'm going to hold all of these for the entire video, but there's this stack. Okay, let's put these down. I'm actually going to start with 2 books that I just literally today and yesterday bought copies of. This is Rejection and Woo Woo, 2 of my favorites from the year. I read library copies of both of these originally, but I loved them so much I decided to buy brand new copies. I think that's something I kind of want to start doing each year, maybe. Still prioritizing the library, but then if I still love a library book that I read by the end of the year, then I'll buy a copy. I think that's kind of a good way to vet the buying process. Anyway, let's talk about Rejection. I think this was a pretty popular book this year. This is a really insane short story collection. 2025 was kind of the year of short stories for me. I really explored a lot of short stories and explored writing short stories myself. As the title suggests, this is all about rejection, specifically in a modern day context. So it's very online, it's very social media. I've said before, it's like the worst people on Reddit in a book. One of the stories that stands out in my mind is this young woman. I think all the characters in here are kind of like in their 20s or 30s. And she is kind of lacking a sense of identity, and she's trying to be cool. And for her, the way that she decides to try to be cool and to try to kind of get a sense of self that she is missing is she gets this pet bird. It is a crow, I believe. And the crow is kind of crazy and aggressive. And so one day this character has some like old college friends over for a baby shower, I believe, for one of her friends. And the crow attacks one of the people at this party. And it's so awkward and uncomfortable. But also, like, you can relate to this woman and how she's trying to craft a sense of identity. Other stories in here have similar themes. So there is another story that really stands out in my memory. I don't actually remember the name. Anyway, whatever the name is, there's a character in here. He's a gay guy. I think he's not in the closet, but he's pretty repressed. And his, like, sexual repression boils over in the most disturbing and surreal way that you could imagine. This book just packs so much punch into every story. And I've heard people describe the endings of these stories as virtuosic. I think that's a great word for it, because it's just the way that these are short stories, and yet the author pulls off these insane endings and these insane story arcs is really masterful, honestly. I don't know my absolute favorite of the year yet. Maybe I will decide through this video. This is up there though, like easily top 3 from the year. I think Woo Woo by Ella Baxter is a candidate for like maybe top 5 of the year, somewhere in there. I love contemporary art. I love performance art. I love any art that feels transgressive or difficult or challenging. So like Carolee Schneemann, for example, or I always mispronounce her name, but Marina Abramovich, whatever it is. Those are 2 kind of older examples, but I love that kind of transgressive artwork. But at the same time, I recognize that kind of section of the art world has a lot of room for criticism. There's a lot of room for humor that can be lacking. It can be a very pretentious part of the art world that I think in some ways really deserves, maybe not mocking, but it deserves, humorous criticism in some ways. I really appreciate this book because it takes on that part of the art scene with a critical eye, but with a respect for the value of that work. It doesn't lean into anti-intellectualism like sometimes critiques of contemporary art can. Maybe people don't want to engage critically with artwork. The kind of art person who only values photorealism, for example. This doesn't feel like that. This feels like the writing of a person who respects and appreciates transgressive work, and yet also recognizes the room for criticism. So what this actually is about is it's about a performance artist living in Australia, I believe. I read this back in February. The performance artist in here, the main character, is not necessarily washed up, but she's not really at the peak of her career. She's maybe feeling a little bit threatened by some of the younger artists that are coming onto the scene. And over the course of the story, she really starts to spiral. She is frequently live streaming herself and kind of trying to connect with a bigger audience by streaming on like Instagram. But then eventually she realizes that she might have a stalker. At the same time, she makes these kind of doll figures that she incorporates into her work. And she starts kind of thinking that those figures are coming to life. I think I mentioned Carolee Schneemann. She plays into this book as well. Schneemann was a very influential performance artist from the 60s and 70s, I want to say. I think this book really interestingly explores the absurdity of some parts of artwork, kind of leaning into the absurd and the alchemy of the absurd. The book also has some really interesting exploration of public versus private life and the way that the boundaries start to blur between the artist and the viewer. This next book was a favorite, but in kind of a non-traditional way, maybe. This is The Deloriad by Missouri Williams. It is a weird post-apocalyptic book that, how do I even really explain it? I have a hard time explaining it or talking about it because I myself haven't fully articulated my own feelings around it. We're following this small group of people who are living, I think, near Prague after some sort of climate apocalypse. Now, the main disturbing element of the story is that this family, this group, they're all like not all of them, but most of them are descendants of incest. The leader of this kind of last remaining group on Earth is a very demanding and kind of evil matriarch, and she feels that she has the moral imperative or the moral requirement to repopulate the earth, essentially. And so she's encouraging incest among her offspring in order to repopulate. A lot of very dark stuff happens in here, even beyond the incest, which is a crazy sentence. There is sexual violence and abuse. There's also the difficult thing about this book for me is the question of what is the author saying versus what is the story saying versus what are the characters saying. So the characters in here are doing a lot of horrible things. There's also quite a bit of ableism, I believe, in the story, as well as general like body image problems and fat phobia. To me, it's clear that the ableism, the fat phobia, the bad things that happen in here, it's clear that those are actions of the characters. They are not the opinions of the author. And yet, I think the way that those really intensely negative things are handled by the author kind of makes the boundary blurry between what the author is saying and what the characters are saying. And I don't know this for sure, but something that I'm thinking about when I think of this book is when you have characters doing such horrible things, when you have characters engaging in sexual violence, it seems like there's maybe a higher bar of responsibility on the author's part to make it clear that they are not endorsing that violence. And I'm not sure that the author managed to create that distinction or managed to condemn the violence sufficiently in this book. So yeah, I have a lot of mixed feelings around this book, and I'm very conflicted about the book. So you might be wondering, why is this on my favorites list? I'm including it on my favorites for the year, reflecting the fact that increasingly reading for me is not about liking a book, but it's about having a fulfilling, fruitful reading experience. Now, don't get me wrong, there are parts of this book that I think are very well done. I'm not even really getting into the depths of the symbolism in here. It ties into a lot of elements of mythology that were really, I think, it was well written in that regard. But more so than appreciating the book or being impressed by the book, I appreciated the things it made me think about. I appreciated the way it kind of stirred some interesting philosophical questions in me. These questions around authorial intent were really interesting to think about as I read this story. And so I'm conflicted about the book, but I'm very appreciative of the reading experience, if that makes sense. Also, admittedly, unique apocalypse books have a very special place in my heart. Is that a phrase? That sounds wrong. I have a deep appreciation for strange apocalyptic books. So yeah, this one is a conflicted favorite. All right, favorites number 4 and 5, I'm kind of doing together. I read these in tandem, basically, so I kind of think of them as a pair. We have The Anatomy of Fascism by Robert O. Paxton, as well as White Evangelical Racism. The Anatomy of Fascism, as you would expect, is about the anatomy of fascism. The author, as far as I understand from my research, this is really one of the most authoritative texts on the topic of fascism. He is breaking down not just what fascists said, but like their actual actions, specifically around thinking kind of in the early 20th century. I don't want to imply by using past tense that fascism is a completely dead ideology. It certainly is not, as which you will learn if you read this book that it is not dead. But he's using the kind of blueprint of early 20th century fascism to try to define what fascism is. One of the difficult traits of fascism is its ideological inconsistency. It constantly is shifting and changing, and so it's hard for scholars to define the distinct characteristics of fascism, which Robert O. Paxton talks about in here, and he tries to address that problem by giving a really detailed breakdown of what fascists did so we can have some sort of definition of fascism. This is definitely an academic text, but it's also quite accessible. It doesn't feel like it's written for Paxton's fellow scholars. It feels like it's written for a university class. My understanding of fascism definitely deepened significantly with this book. Really, really valuable. It's kind of stressful to have this knowledge now because there are parallels, folks. There are parallels. Many of those parallels are illustrated by Anthea Butler in White Evangelical Racism. This is about white evangelical racism. She is talking about the racism of evangelical ideology in America. She takes us, it's been a bit since I've read it. So yeah, she takes us from the 19th century all the way through modern day. It's a very short book, but she's giving us these very effective summaries of all of these periods over the decades, over the centuries, summarizing the roots of these ideologies, summarizing how these ideologies of racism and evangelicalism have worked together over the years to shape a lot of American politics. And between these two books, you can start to see some of the ideological parallels between these ideologies. I'm saying ideology a lot. Okay, we have 6 more books. So I guess this is my top 11 favorite books of the year. A really fantastic classic that I'm so happy I finally read, The Color Purple. This is one of those books that doesn't feel like there's much to say about it. You can see I tabbed the hell out of this book. Actually, there's not that many tabs, I guess. It felt like I tabbed the hell. I think at some point I kind of stopped tabbing because I was going to be like tabbing a million different things. Did I underline stuff? I don't even remember. Okay, maybe I didn't tab that much and I didn't underline anything, but I love this book. It is kind of you could say like a family saga, but it's more of like a sister saga. The quick version is it's about sisters and other people in their lives, other women in this whole group, confronting racism, confronting abuse from men, confronting homophobia, confronting sexuality, and really deeply confronting God and the concept of God. For me, I read this book over just a few days in the summer, and a lot of that time I spent reading outside, or when I wasn't reading, I had free time over the summer, so I was out in nature. As I said, a lot of this book explores God, and a lot of the way that it explores God ties into nature. I guess I didn't say that this book is set. When is it set? Like in the 20s, maybe? I think it's set in the 20s. I could be wrong. But it's set in the earlier 20th century, in lots of rural areas and lots of impoverished areas. And so nature plays a pretty big role in the story. And so the experience of reading this beautiful writing about the concepts of God and these questions about spirituality while being outside myself was a deeply transcendental experience for me. It was extremely, extremely moving. I don't think I can really convey how much I love this book. I care so much about the characters in here, and I feel like they're real people, and I want them to be so happy. And Also, I should say, if you have seen the movie and you're thinking about, like, should I read this book? You absolutely should. I also had seen the movie prior to reading this book. The movie, not a fan, gotta say at this point. I think a lot of people love the movie, so I don't want to talk bad about it. I think it is a very different story compared to this book, particularly when it comes to the queer elements. This is a very deeply queer story in many ways. I don't think that translated in the film. And yeah, I just love this. I don't think I'm saying anything very valuable about it, but another big favorite for me this year was Berlin Atomized by, I've mispronounced this author's name so many times, Julia Kornberg. I've said Kronberg before. Berlin Atomized by Julia Kornberg. This was translated from Spanish by Jack Rockwell as well as the author. I adore this book. Oh my gosh. It was recommended by a Bookstagram friend, Steven. I'm so glad he recommended it, and I'm so glad that I read it. This is also maybe among the top 3 if I have to choose for the year. But very simply, it is about siblings who grow up pretty privileged and somewhat wealthy, and we are following them throughout the 21st century as the world is increasingly unstable. Political violence, civil wars, economic uncertainty, all the things that you could imagine and all the things we have experienced of political and social uncertainty and instability. And we're seeing how they navigate those things. And a lot of it explores the way that their privilege affects their experience with those experiences. I've said it before because I've talked about this book a lot. That sounds like a simple plot and it sounds like a simple concept. And it is, admittedly, but there is something so propulsive about this author's writing and about the way the book unfolds that I just truly was obsessed. I can't really explain what it is. It's another one that you need to read to experience. The commentary, the themes are all interesting and compelling, but it's something very intangible about this book that just it's... I also have said this before, but the cover really captures whatever that feeling is. I heard that this author is writing another book, maybe her second book. She's releasing something else. I think it comes out in 3 years though. So that's depressing that it's going to be so far away. My throat is feeling even worse at this point. So cheers. Sorry, can you hear me swallowing? That's gross. You know what? Let's pause on the books for a second. I don't think I've shown off this mug before. I'm kind of into collecting cool vintage mugs, and I'm thinking about this one because I got it for Christmas last year from my brother. Maybe the lighting is kind of hard to see it, but it's a vintage San Diego Zoo mug from the 80s, 1988. It's not that vintage, I guess, but this is one of my favorite art styles, this kind of illustrated jungle, maybe you'd say. Okay, that was a random detour, but I also really, really loved Living Things this year. This is how would I describe it? I think this is what I might label postmodern fiction. And I don't know that I can right now articulate what makes it specifically postmodern, but that's the word that comes to mind. This is about 4 graduates. They've recently graduated from university, and they travel from Madrid to the south of France to work for the grape harvest I think it's in the summer. They're all pretty privileged, obviously, they're educated, they've just graduated from university, but they all have different kind of motivations for wanting to go to France and do this manual labor that, because of their economic status, is kind of below them. And I say that not in a demeaning way, but in a way of that's how the characters feel in here. It's not work that they need to do for money or for succeeding in life or surviving in life. They're doing it because they want a unique experience. It's kind of a game for them. In particular, the narrator in here wants to be a writer, and so he's thinking about this summer work as a way to gain unique experiences in life so that he has something to write about. So they're coming into this manual labor from a kind of a weirdly privileged position, or for this kind of weird perspective on it. Things start going wrong very quickly though. They're staying at this campsite near where they're going to be working, and they're causing all sorts of chaos. They're very disruptive and not respectful of the other people at the site. They also aren't able to work for the grape harvest as they expected. So some of them end up doing really intense manual labor in a meat processing facility. So the book is exploring capitalism. Specifically, I would say capitalism and how it ties into the climate and into nature. The characters in here are often at the forefront of disrespecting nature. They're kind of disrespecting the nature of this campsite that they're staying at. They're also complicit and active in the degradation of nature in this meat processing facility where the animals are not being treated well. And that kind of degradation of nature, as it ties to their employment, culminates in a very surreal ending, which of course I won't spoil. I was really impressed by this book. I think it manages to capture interesting social commentary, like I mentioned, while also having just a genuinely compelling sense of rhythm and a fast-paced kind of plot line. And it left me asking quite a few questions about what actually happened in the story. There is some room for mystery in here, which I appreciated. Okay, 3 more books here on my list. Let's talk about Not One Day by Anne Greta. I don't think I've talked about this on this channel yet. I've been way more active about my reading updates on Instagram lately, so follow me over there, I guess. Not One Day is a piece of experimental fiction, ? The narrator, or is it the author, says that she is going to spend one day every day for a month writing about people that she has known from her past, and specifically people that she has fallen in love with or experienced love with. So the book is exploring memory, it's exploring love and romance. The experimental element in here is difficult to talk about without spoiling some things. But basically, the author is really blurring the boundaries between character and author. She also blurs the boundary between fact and fiction in a really fascinating way that I was super compelling. It's kind of a rug pull of a book, you know? You might think you have a grasp on what's happening, but then you get to the end and everything changes in a really unique way. I get the sense that there are probably little moments kind of hinting at the ending throughout the book that I would notice on a second read. But yeah, I can't say much else about it without spoiling. It's very short, so if you're at all interested, I really, really recommend checking it out. Another book that was kind of a conflicted favorite this year, this is The Passion According to G.H. by Clarice Lispector. Now, admittedly, I was not familiar with Lispector until this year, which I will not be embarrassed about, because we're always learning, but I have since learned how influential and important she is as an author. This is about a woman who goes into her maid's room in her house in Rio, and she sees a cockroach, and she's disgusted, so she slams the door, and upon seeing the cockroach there dying, she starts to have an existential crisis. The book is often pitched as having an ending that is one of the most shocking endings in Latin American literature. I think that is an extreme exaggeration. I don't think the ending is very shocking. I think you can see the ending from a mile away, to be honest. So I say that because I went into this book with kind of the wrong mindset. I was waiting for this shocking ending. I was just kind of sitting there anticipating a shocking ending. And that's a problem when reading Lispector, because Lispector's writing is very difficult. It's quite, not necessarily dense, but it is opaque. It is weird and hypnotically rhythmic in a way that's boring, but also deeply compelling. The only way that I know how to describe it is it feels like her words, her prose, is creating a window which allow you to see through into an idea which is not being articulated by the text. The prose itself is not articulating a concept, but it's trying to put you in the right mindset in order to think about a concept. I don't know if that makes sense. You have to read it to experience it. The character, like I said, is experiencing an existential crisis in some ways. The back of the book describes it as a mystical crisis. So there are themes of what is the point of life, what comes after life, what are we doing with our lives. But those themes are explored in very intangible and slippery ways. I would describe a lot of the prose as circuitous. So hopefully that prepares you if you want to read this book. I do recommend it. It's not fun. It wasn't fun for me. It wasn't entertaining. It was really difficult, but also very satisfying and fascinating. So yeah. Okay, the last book on my list. This might also be in the top. This is more in the top 5, I think. Bitter Eden by Tatum Kulu Africa was maybe the first book I read this year, I think. So this is set during World War II in Italy, I believe. We have a group of men who are fighting for the Allies, and they become prisoners of war. The book is also, I should say, semi-autobiographical. The author himself was also a prisoner of war, I believe, during World War II. So they are suddenly taken from the realities of their everyday life, thrown into war, the chaos of war, and then suddenly thrown into this almost weirdly peaceful environment. And I say peaceful with hesitancy here because it's a prison camp, of course, but suddenly they have a lot of time on their hands, and they are very much so stuck in close proximity to each other. And so they start having to examine and reckon with their sexualities and start thinking about their sexualities in new ways. So as you can imagine, there is a lot of emotional complexity to this book. The characters are navigating the horror of war, but they're also discovering things about themselves and kind of fighting with themselves, but also starting to accept themselves. I was surprised at times at how funny the book could be. The kind of strange thing about this prison camp setting is they have a unique kind of, or not unique, but they have a degree of freedom that you might not expect. Maybe if you're more familiar with the history of World War II prisoners of war, you might not be as surprised as I was. But learning more about the things that they could do while prisoners, they have a theater where they can put on shows. They have space out to exercise. And so there's this kind of odd sense that they're in like a weird purgatory where time has frozen for them. This very surreal, degrading environment of the prison camp allows them a unique space to discover themselves, which they wouldn't have had outside the camp. So there's this strange emotional conflict there. So yeah, deeply emotional on multiple levels. I would call this like a forgotten classic of literature in general, certainly a forgotten classic of queer literature. If we're using Goodreads as a metric here, I think this does have less than 1,000 ratings on there. So yeah, this is not read nearly enough, not talked about enough. Okay, there are my top 11 books of the year. Oh wait, I was missing these 2 books from this stack. Okay, that is the stack of my 11 favorite from the year. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you've read any of my favorites. I'd love to discuss them in the comments. And let me know your favorites from the year. And if you have any recommendations based on these, of course. So, is it like 1 a.m. at this point? Yeah, it's late. Okay, good night.